Week 7 of lockdown lessons continues for us grade 10s. Welcome to our second lesson of the week. Please note that I have set up additional platforms for communication. We shall continue with Edmodo as our primary means of interaction. I have also created a Facebook page, Mrs. M Teaches English, which you can join. For all pupils, a new email address has been created to support interaction on Facebook and YouTube. The email address is mrsmteachesenglish2020@gmail.com. I do look forward to hearing from you. In today's lesson, we'll focus on Act 5, Scenes 2 and 3. The lesson is divided into two parts. In the first section, we'll go over the answers to Act 5, Scene 1. For the rest of the lesson, we'll study Scenes 2 and 3 of this, the final act of the play. Have everything that you need before we continue with this video lesson. Let's get started with a quick recap of the first scene. Lady Macbeth inadvertently let slip many of her crimes during her sleepwalking scene. Do you have any others that you can add to the ones listed here? Pause the video so that you can add to your own notes. Lady Macbeth's language, her diction, is very interesting in this scene. Here she comes across as a vulnerable woman, a woman with a conscience. She seems to negate many of the things she said in earlier scenes. It's ironic that she's now the one who references Banquo's appearance as a ghost. When she says, "What's done cannot be undone," we are reminded of her words in Act 3, Scene 2, when she confidently reassured her husband that what's done is done. The irony is evident in the way her own words have been twisted in this scene. The actual syntax of Lady Macbeth's speech changes in this scene. In the past, she has sounded like the witches, speaking confidently in a rhythmic and rhyming pattern. Here she speaks in prose, an ordinary person wrestling with her conscience as she is tormented by guilt. Let's move on to the next scene, Scene 2. As you can see from the picture that I have selected for this slide, the British Army and the volunteers are in a forest, Burnham Forest. Turn to page 140 in your textbook. This scene is a clever piece of stagecraft. Shakespeare cannot practically have hundreds of actors dressed as soldiers traipsing across the stage. So he writes these short scenes in which he conveys these plot developments to the audience. We immediately recognize the reference to Birnam Wood, and we appreciate the development of the clothing imagery, that Macbeth is dressed in borrowed robes. Pay attention in the next slide, as Mark Birch gives you his detailed analysis of this scene.
Hi, this is Mark Birch with a quick revision of Macbeth Act 5 Scene 2. Here we have a number of Scottish lords who comment on what's about to happen with the English forces alongside Malcolm and Macduff, who are approaching Macbeth's castle. Notice that we have an epithet ascribed to Macduff that's in enormous contrast to those ascribed to Macbeth. Here it's good Macduff, something that demonstrates the high regard in which he's held by the Scottish lords. Also, we have a reference, a hyperbolic reference, to the kind of feelings exhibited by Macduff, Malcolm, etc. Revenges burn in them, and that metaphorical use of the verb burn really gives a sense of the passion and the depth of feeling exhibited by Macduff and Malcolm, given the murders of their respective families. And this is made even more clear through the fact that their dear causes would to the bleeding and the grim alarm excite the mortified man. In other words, they have causes that affect them dearly. Shakespeare's using this hyperbolic metaphor of a mortified man, a dead man, being excited to get into the bloodshed and the noise of war because of the kind of causes that are driving them. In this case, the murder of the father for Malcolm and the family for Macduff. In reference to Macbeth, Caithness says, "Some say he's mad, others that lesser hate him do call it valiant fury." And one of the interesting things about this is that Shakespeare's conveying the lack of love for Macbeth in Scotland through the use of a comparative, not through antithesis. It's not that some say he's mad, others say that he's perfectly sane, but it's either he's mad or if they hate him less, they call it valiant fury. So it's just people either hate him or hate him a little bit. There's no love for Macbeth. So that use of lesser is really important as a comparative adjective. Macbeth's bravery, which was seen as so positive in Act 1, Scene 2, has now been transformed into something negative. Those that hate him slightly less describe his behaviour as valiant fury. And so it's a bravery that's associated with outrage and anger, certainly not something positive. However, Caithness says that while there may be some doubt over the level of hatred for Macbeth, what is certain is that he cannot buckle his distempered cause within the belt of rule. So we have a metaphor here of Macbeth being unable to constrain his bloated rule, rather like someone trying to put a belt around their waist when they're so fat that they're unable to actually buckle it. This is what Macbeth's rule's like. It's so chaotic, it's so overblown, it's so full of ill behaviours that it's impossible to create a sense of order. Angus's comments are structured through the use of anaphora. So we have, now does he feel, now minutely revolts, now does he feel his title. So the anaphora that begins each of those clauses with now gives a sense of how overwhelmed Macbeth is at this particular point in time. It's as if the ingredients of the poison chalice are returning to plague the inventor, that everything is coming back to haunt him. The reference to his secret murder sticking on his hands is an allusion to Act 2, Scene 2 again. Now the blood on Macbeth's hands is universalised. It can't be washed away and everyone can now see his guilt. The reference to his secret murder sticking on his hands is an allusion to Act 2, Scene 2 again. Now the blood on Macbeth's hands is universalised. It can't be washed away and everyone can now see his guilt. And then we have an extended simile to show how unsuited Macbeth is to his role as king. It echoes the metaphor used earlier about being unable to buckle his belt. Here he feels his title hang loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarvish fief. So he has this mantle, this giant's robe, something that's enormous responsibility, the role of king, resting upon the shoulders of a dwarvish fief. He's a little man, absolutely unscrupulous and immoral man who is taking on this role that just doesn't fit him. It's not suited to him. Shakespeare goes on to employ two extended metaphors, the first a medical one and the second a horticultural one. In terms of the medical, we have this idea of the sickly wheel being purged. So it's the idea really of soldiers returning to this sickly country of Scotland and purging it by spilling their blood. And then secondly, the horticultural metaphor uses this idea of that blood watering the true monarchy to dew the sovereign flower and drowning the weeds of Macbeth's rule. And finally, Lennox concludes with, "Make we our march towards Burnham," the scene ending on an ominous note, foreshadowing Macbeth's final downfall given the prophecy of the third apparition. It's almost as if Shakespeare ends the scene with a duh-duh-duh. Okay, ta.
Here are your questions for Act 5, Scene 2. Pause the video and answer them in writing in your notebooks. You'll have to think carefully about the quotes used in these questions. What do they mean? Remember that you have the modern English text of the play on the right-hand pages in your textbook. Act 5, Scene 3 is short. It shows Macbeth preparing for his final battle. It's all bad news for Macbeth in this scene. He is annoyed to hear that many of his noblemen and soldiers have defected. A messenger tells him that more than 10,000 English soldiers are approaching his castle, and his wife, Lady Macbeth, is now as mad as a hatter, apparently. Macbeth clings to the witch's prophecies. He'll be safe, he reckons, until Birnam Wood marches to Dunsinane. You have to feel bad for the messengers in this scene. Watch out for Macbeth's insults, such as "thou lily-livered boy," and take note of how he speaks to his servant, Seaton. In the next slide, Mark Birch will give you a detailed analysis of this scene.
Hi, this is Mark Birch with a quick revision of Macbeth Act 5, Scene 3. Shakespeare begins the scene with an arrogant Macbeth stating, "Bring me no more reports, let them all fly, till Birnam Wood remove to Dunsinane I cannot taint with fear." And this is really interesting structurally because Shakespeare's juxtaposed this scene with the previous scene that concluded with the Scottish lords proclaiming their march towards Birnam. So we've got Birnam Wood about to move to Dunsinane. The audience is very aware of it, and so Shakespeare's preparing the audience for Macbeth's tragic fall as a result of his hubris, as a result of this kind of arrogant pride. Macbeth recounts the premonitions that have given him this hubris. What's the boy Malcolm? Was he not born of woman? He essentially feels completely invulnerable. And what Shakespeare's doing is reminding us that the cause of that hubris is the supernatural. The spirits that know all mortal consequences are those that have pronounced me thus, and therefore removed all of Macbeth's fear. Macbeth calls to the Scottish lords who are departing his castle, stating, "Fly, false fanes, and mingle with the English epicures." In other words, dismissing them. He doesn't need these people to defend his castle because he feels invulnerable. One of the things that's interesting about it is the use of phonological devices. You have fly, false fanes, and then English epicures. So these two groups of people are connected because the same kinds of phonological features define them. We have the alliteration in fly, false, and then that's directly juxtaposed to the assonance in English epicures. You can hear that there's the same kind of process being applied to both of their descriptions, and thereby they seem to have a similarity. And for Macbeth, of course, they are similar in that they're going to join forces against him, and that's represented, therefore, by that phonological similarity. Macbeth goes on to say, "The mind I sway by and the heart I bear shall never sag with doubt nor shake with fear." The parallelism in "the mind I sway by and the heart I bear" gives a sense of the whole of him being resolved, both his mind and his heart, his reason and his emotions are both conjoined in recognizing that he will never submit to doubt or fear. In the following utterances, Shakespeare goes on to employ colour symbolism to represent fear. And it's interesting that despite fearlessness being a key aspect of Macbeth's imminent downfall, Shakespeare presents him as mocking fear in others. He's just claimed not to submit to fear, and yet when he examines it in those around him, he sees it as an opportunity to gloat at their perceived weakness. Therefore, when we have the servant come in, he's described as a cream-faced loon. He's a lily-livered boy with linen cheeks, whey-face. All of these are linked to whiteness, and whiteness is symbolic of cowardice. He asks him to over-red thy fear, to pinch his face, to make his cheeks go a little bit redder in order to disguise the fear that's apparent in that white complexion. We then start to get a little bit of pity for Macbeth. We've moved from this mocking, hubris-ridden character to one that seems to recognise his fate. He says, "This push will cheer me ever or disseat me now." The antithetical parallelism recognising that there is a stark contrast in what lies ahead. Either he will be secure on the throne and happy forever, cheer me ever, or he will be deceited now. So he will lose his throne and ultimately lose his life. He says, "I've lived long enough. My way of life is fallen into the sere, the yellow leaf." So we have this horticultural metaphor. It's the idea of Macbeth's life as a dying plant, echoing Act 5, Scene 2. And there's this sense of self-awareness that's evident in the rest of this speech as well, that reminds the audience of Macbeth's nobility, that nobility that was demonstrated at the beginning of the play, and that was referred to in Act 1, Scene 2, creating the opportunity for pity as a crucial part of the play's tragic conclusion. We shouldn't just be celebrating the fall of the tragic character. We should recognise that this is a loss in some way, and there has been a manipulation of Macbeth by external forces. Macbeth's statement that "I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked" is once again a reminder of Act 1, Scene 2, because we have an articulation of his bravery, his violence, and once again there's that horror there, which is very similar to the Macbeth described by the captain in Act 1, Scene 2. A reading makes it difficult to appreciate the dramatic significance of the process of Macbeth putting on his armour, but we get a sense of Macbeth's frustration and impatience through the kind of rush that's engaged in here in order to put his armour on, even when it's not needed. So that he says, "Give me my armour." Satan tells him it's not needed yet. "I'll put it on." And then later, "Come put mine armour on." "Come, sir, dispatch." And then, "Pull it off, I say." It's all over the place. So Macbeth is clearly in a situation where he's not in his right mind, he's not ordered, he's not dealing with the current situation in the way that someone who's in command should. We get more sense of Macbeth's impatience when he states, "Throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it." Just because the doctor says that he can't cure Lady Macbeth, the patient must minister to himself, then Macbeth kind of dismisses the whole concept of medicine itself. He'll throw physic to the dogs. Macbeth proposes to the doctor that if he could find the disease of Scotland, Macbeth would applaud him. And that's deeply ironic, because Macbeth is himself the disease that's plaguing Scotland. We've got the same kind of imagery that was used in Act 5, Scene 2, when the Scottish lords stated, "Meet we the medicine of the sickly weal." So Macbeth and the Scottish lords both appreciate that Scotland's in a terrible state. The difference is that the lords recognise that this is because of Macbeth's rule, whereas Macbeth is in a state of ignorance, refusing to accept that this is a result of his own rule. Okay, ta.
Here are 5 more questions for you. Note that there are various spellings of Seaton, the name of Macbeth's messenger. Would it change anything if his name were pronounced Satan? What do you think? Here are some important quotes from Scene 3. I must say that I do have some grudging admiration for Macbeth here. He's going to go down fighting. We see glimmers of that courageous soldier that we heard about in Act 1. I am sure that you'll be able to add to your notes on ambition, guilt, and fate after studying these 2 scenes. We're done for today, Grade 10. I will see you in our next lesson. And take some advice from Lady Macbeth. Wash your hands regularly.